Standing in Rome in the year 400 AD, you're surrounded by marble columns that touch the sky, and aqueducts carrying fresh water over horizons, and the Colosseum holding 50,000 screaming fans, and you're standing in the capital of the greatest empire the world has ever known, spanning 3 continents and lasting for 1,000 years. If you tapped a Roman citizen on the shoulder and told them that in just 76 years this entire city would be empty ruins, and the empire would vanish from the face of the earth, they would have laughed in your face and called you crazy, where Rome is eternal and Rome is invincible and the systems are too big to fail. Now fast forward to today, where you stand in Times Square in New York City looking at skyscrapers and stock tickers flashing record highs and military power dominating every ocean on the globe. And if I told you that by the year 2026, the foundations of this American empire would irrevocably crack, you would probably have the exact same reaction. But history is not a set of random events, but a blueprint representing a repeating cycle of rise and fall driven by unchanging human nature, where we are not special, but just the latest actors in a very old play. And right now, we are in the final act. Before we continue, though, understanding how currency debasement destroyed Rome through a 200-year process that America is repeating in 50 years diverges sharply from mainstream narratives that modern economies are too sophisticated to collapse. Real economic history requires studying these empire life cycle patterns, so subscribe to the channel so you never get caught off guard by financial crises. Rome wasn't always corrupt, where in its early days, during the Roman Republic, it was a society built on what historians call Stoic virtues, including hard men and farmers who became soldiers to defend their land and then returned to farming. There was a deep sense of duty and frugality and shared destiny, and economically, this was reflected in their money, where for centuries the Roman currency was the silver denarius, representing a coin made of almost pure silver. It was sound money, where if you held a denarius, you held actual intrinsic value, and you didn't have to trust the government, but only had to trust the metal in your hand. This sound money created a stable foundation where it encouraged savings and allowed for long-term planning and funded the roads and the aqueducts and the mighty legions that conquered the known world, and because the money was real, the economy was real. But success is a dangerous drug, where as Rome conquered more territory, immense wealth flooded into the capital, and the ruling class stopped being warrior farmers and became wealthy aristocrats, and the focus shifted from production to consumption. By the time the Republic died and the Roman Empire began under Augustus Caesar, the seeds of decay were already planted, where the empire was vast, stretching from England to Egypt, and maintaining this expanse was incredibly expensive. You had to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed thousands of miles away, and you had to build and repair infrastructure across continents, and most importantly, you had to keep the population of Rome happy. This is where the concept of bread and circuses originated, where to keep the massive unemployed population of the city from rioting, the emperors provided free grain and massive gladiatorial games representing the ancient version of welfare and endless entertainment distraction. All of this cost enormous amounts of money, where the gold and silver looted from conquered nations began to dry up, and the expenses of the empire started to outweigh its income, and Rome had a budget deficit. Now, an emperor has 2 choices when faced with a deficit, where choice 1 is the hard choice, including you can cut spending, which makes citizens angry, or you can raise taxes, which makes the rich, powerful people angry. No emperor wanted to do that where they wanted to be loved, and they wanted to be gloried, so they chose the easy path representing the fatal mistake where they decided to mess with the money. This is the mechanism of collapse, and pay close attention, because this is exactly where we are today. It started slowly, where around the year 64, AD Emperor Nero faced a financial crisis, and he needed more money to pay his debts and fund his lavish lifestyle, and he came up with a devious idea. He gathered up the silver denarius coins and melted them down and mixed in a small amount of cheap base metals like copper, and then reminted the coins, and suddenly Nero had more coins to spend. The new denarius looked the same as the old one on the surface, where it had the emperor's face on it, and it was officially declared to be worth the same amount, but in reality it had less silver and less intrinsic value. This was the ancient version of money printing where Nero had just debased the currency, and at first nobody noticed where the party continued. But subsequent emperors saw how easy this was, where if they needed to fund a war, they just added more copper to the silver mix, and if they needed to build a new palace, they just debased the currency a little more. Over the next 200 years, this process accelerated, where by the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, around 170 AD, the denarius was only about 75% silver. 50 years later, it was down to 50% silver. And by the year 270 AD, under Emperor Aurelian, the denarius had become a joke, where it was barely 5% silver, representing basically a bronze coin with a thin silver wash over it that rubbed off after a few uses. The Roman government had effectively stolen the wealth of its people slowly over 2 centuries. Was happening. Merchants and traders and was happening. Merchants and traders and soldiers realized that the coins they were receiving were junk, where they knew the government was lying to them about the value of the money, and the result was catastrophic inflation. Because the money was worth less, merchants demanded more of it for the same goods, where the price of wheat and oil and clothing skyrocketed, and we have records showing that in the 2nd century, a specific measure of wheat cost around 8 drachmas. By the 3rd century, that same measure of wheat cost 120,000 drachmas, where savings were wiped out. If you'd saved good silver coins your whole life, the government's new junk coins made your nest egg worthless, where the middle class was evaporated. To combat this, emperors tried even more desperate measures, where Emperor Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices in the year 301 AD, basically making it illegal to raise prices under penalty of death. And it failed miserably. Merchants simply stopped selling goods, or they moved their activities to the black market, where shortages spread across the empire and people were starving in the streets because the economic system had completely broken down. The soldiers on the frontiers, realizing they were being paid in worthless metal, began to mutiny, where they abandoned their posts, and they cared more about survival than defending a capital city that was robbing them. And this is the crucial point. The barbarians didn't break through Rome's walls because they were suddenly stronger, but they broke through because Rome was weaker. The financial rot had destroyed the social contract, where why fight for an empire that pays you in fake money, and why produce goods for a system that punishes savers? When the money dies, trust dies, and when trust dies, the empire dies, where the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, not with a bang, but with a whimper, walking into a hollow shell of a once great civilization. Now let us turn that mirror toward ourselves and look at the United States of America. Just like Rome, America began with a currency backed by hard assets, where the US dollar was for a long time a receipt for gold, representing a promise that the government could not simply print its way out of trouble. This discipline helped build the greatest industrial engine in human history, and just like Rome, America became the undisputed global superpower after a massive global conflict being World War II. We became the world's policemen, and we established military bases in vast corners of the globe, and we became incredibly wealthy, shifting from a nation of hardworking producers to a nation of high-consuming debtors. And just like Rome, we reached a point where our ambitions outweighed our wallet, where we wanted the guns and butter, including massive military spending, to maintain our global empire and massive social welfare programs at home. Starting in the 1960s, the pressure began to mount, where we were fighting the Vietnam War and launching the Great Society program simultaneously, and gold was draining out of the U.S. Treasury as foreign nations demanded payment. So in 1971, President Richard Nixon did exactly what Emperor Nero did, where he closed the gold window and declared that the U.S. dollar was no longer convertible into gold. In that instant, the U.S. dollar stopped being a receipt for reality and started being a fiat currency, where its value was now based entirely on faith in the United States government, and we switched from the silver denarius to the copper coin. Since 1971, the debasement of the U.S. dollar has been relentless, but unlike Rome, which was limited by how fast they could physically melt down and remint metal coins, we have no physical limitations. We can create trillions of dollars with a few keystrokes on a computer at the Federal Reserve, where this allows us to speedrun the collapse, and what took Rome 200 years we are achieving in 50. Look at the national debt, where it took the United States over 200 years to accumulate its first $1 trillion in debt, But today we add a new $1 trillion to the debt every few months, where we are now over $34 trillion in debt. This number is so large the human brain cannot comprehend it, and how are we paying our bills? We are printing the money where the Federal Reserve creates new dollars out of thin air to buy the government's debt. This is exactly the same mechanism as adding base metal to the silver coin, where every new dollar that is printed dilutes the purchasing power of every dollar you worked hard to save. We are already seeing the cracks form where we are already seeing the inflation, and you feel it every time you go to the grocery store, and you feel it when you look at housing prices that have become completely disconnected from reality. The government will try to tell you inflation is low, just like Roman emperors claimed their copper coins were silver, but your bank account knows the truth. We are seeing the breakdown of the social contract, where just like late-stage Rome, America is facing intense internal division, and the gap between the super-rich, who benefit from the money printing, and the working class is wider than at any point since the Gilded Age. We are seeing the rise of bread and circuses, where we are distracted by endless entertainment cycles and social media dopamine loops and celebrity gossip, while the foundations of our economic house are being eaten away by termites. We have a population heavily dependent on government assistance, creating a political feedback loop that makes cutting spending political suicide. And now, we look at the timeline where Sir John Glubb, a British historian, analyzed the life cycles of great empires over 3,000 years and found a startling pattern. The Assyrians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Roman Republic and the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire all lasted for an average of about 250 years. They go through the same stages, including the Age of Pioneers and the Age of Conquests and the Age of Commerce and the Age of Affluence and the Age of Intellect, and finally the Age of Decadence and Decline. The Age of Decadence is marked by debt and an influx of foreigners and a welfare state and a weakening of the shared values that built the empire. And does that sound familiar? The United States declared independence in 1776, where if you add 250 years to that date, you land squarely on the year 2026. And we are mathematically at the end of the historical average lifespan of a superpower. We have checked every single box on the list of empire collapse symptomatology, including the massive debt and the currency debasement and the military overextension and the internal social division. The Roman Empire's final mistake was believing that the laws of economics didn't apply to them because they were Rome, where they thought they could cheat the system by diminishing their currency and that the rest of the world would just accept it forever. America's final mistake is exactly the same, where we believe that because the US dollar is the world reserve currency, we can print infinite amounts of it without consequence. We believe that we can borrow more money than has ever existed in human history and never have to pay it back in real terms, but the rest of the world is waking up. Just like the merchants in ancient Rome began to refuse the debased denarius, we see nations around the world, from China to Russia to Saudi Arabia, actively taking steps to move away from the US dollar in global trade. These are the modern barbarians at the gate, where they are not attacking with swords, but they are attacking by simply rejecting our debt. If the world stops accepting dollars for real goods like oil and manufactured products, all those trillions of printed dollars will flood back into the domestic U.S. economy, and the result will not just be the inflation we see today, but hyperinflation that wipes out the middle class overnight. The year 2026 is not a doomsday prediction where the world ends on a Tuesday, but it is a historical marker representing the point where the mathematical weight of our debt and debasement becomes unsustainable. It is the point where the interest payments on our national debt become larger than our entire defense budget, representing the point of no return. When Rome fell, it wasn't the end of the world where humanity survived and Italy survived, but the structure of that society, including the comfort and the security and the global dominance, vanished into the Dark Ages. Those who were dependent on the system were crushed when the system failed, but those who survived and even thrived during the collapse of Rome were the ones who saw it coming. They were the ones who held real assets, including land and gold and silver and productive skills, instead of relying on the debased currency of a dying state. The warning signs are flashing red where history is screaming at us across the centuries, and the mistake has already been made and the poison is already in the system. The only question now is how long the patient has left and what you're going to do to prepare for the inevitable reset. We cannot stop the cycle of empire where it is bigger than any of us and it is bigger than any politician, but we can learn from it. We can refuse to be like the Roman citizens standing in the Colosseum, believing that the party will last forever, where we can open our eyes and see the ruins before they happen. The clock is ticking toward 2026, and the final act has begun. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want. Knowing from you, though. If Rome's currency debasement from 64 AD to 410 AD followed a predictable pattern, including budget deficits, leading to money printing, leading to inflation, leading to social breakdown, leading to collapse, and America has replicated this exact sequence since 1971 but compressed into 50 years instead of 200. Does this prove that empire life cycles follow inevitable mathematical patterns that cannot be escaped regardless of technological advancement or modern economic theory, or does it ignore fundamental differences, including the dollar's reserve currency status and America's nuclear deterrent and global interconnected systems that create conditions unlike any previous empire in history? That distinction determines whether the 2026 timeline represents genuine historical pattern recognition, warning of systemic collapse, or whether it's deterministic thinking that underestimates humanity's capacity to adapt and reform institutions before reaching the point of no return. So drop your take in the comments, because I genuinely want hearing whether you think empire cycles are mathematically inevitable or whether modern systems have fundamentally changed the rules. The warning signs are flashing red where history is screaming at us across the centuries, and the only question now is what you're going to do with this knowledge.